Everyone in the neighborhood stopped what they were doing when they saw the little wooden fishing boat gliding out onto the wide, sparkling lake. The late afternoon sun shimmered on the water like a sheet of molten glass, and for a moment, the scene might have been peaceful, even idyllic. But the peace didn't last. Because when their eyes focused on who was in that boat, a ripple of murmurs traveled across the manicured lawns. The man standing tall at the bow wasn't one of them. He wasn't part of their HOA cliques, their wine nights, their barbecue circles. He was Elijah Brooks the Quiet, broad-shouldered black rancher who had bought the property at the edge of the development 2 years ago. He was a man who kept mostly to himself, tending his cattle, fixing fences, and working his land. He didn't come to HOA meetings. He didn't nod and smile when Brenda, the HOA president, strutted around issuing her sharp little orders. Didn't fit their mold, and that alone made him a target. Elijah wasn't thinking about any of that. For him, the lake was more than just a body of water. It was a memory. His grandfather had taken him fishing on lakes just like this one, teaching him patience, the art of waiting, the joy of stillness. Those days on the water had been his sanctuary, long before life had hardened him with responsibilities and losses. When he bought his ranch, part of the reason was that this lake sat right on its border, connected to a stream that ran through his land. He had walked its shoreline the day he signed the deed and whispered to himself, "This one's mine now." "Ours, Grandpa." That boat gliding across the water wasn't something bought at a store. Elijah had built it by hand. He'd chosen cedar planks, shaped them carefully, sanded until his hands ached, and sealed it with care. Each strike of the hammer, each brush of varnish, was a piece of himself poured into it. And now, seeing it float steady on the water, he felt a deep satisfaction. And for the first time in years, he could almost hear his grandfather's voice again. But his peace was broken by the sight of figures gathering at the shore. A cluster of HOA members had abandoned their porches and wine, glasses to stand in a knot near the water's edge. Some shaded their eyes with their hands, squinting at him. Others simply pointed, whispering as though he were some trespasser. And at the center of it all was Brenda the Queen Bee herself. Brenda was a tall woman with sharp cheekbones always, dressed as if she were headed to a country club. She thrived on control, on making rules and bending people under them. From the first week, Elijah moved in. She had tried to welcome him with a binder full of HOA restrictions, delivered with a smile that was more warning than kindness. He had thanked her, taken the binder, and then never once showed up at a meeting. That alone had been enough to paint him as a rebel. Now Brenda stood at the water's edge, hands on her hips, barking at the neighbors around her. "He doesn't own that lake," she snapped. "That's community property. Can't just float some ranch boat in here like it's his personal pond." Birds carried, slicing through the summer air. Elijah heard them clearly, but he didn't even turn his head. He let the boat drift, dipping the oars into the water with slow, deliberate strokes. He wasn't out there for her approval, but Brenda wasn't the type to let things slide. Within minutes, she was on her phone, her voice shrill. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser. Zoo. He's unauthorized. He's violating HOA lake policies." And she paused, glancing at Elijah, lowering her voice, though he still caught it. "He's becoming aggressive." Aggressive. Elijah almost laughed. He was sitting in a cedar boat with a fishing pole. The only thing aggressive about him was the way he was ignoring her. But he knew her type. She had a way of twisting the story, and once police got involved, stories like hers carried weight. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, 2 squad cars rolled up, lights flashing. The neighborhood came alive at the sight, with residents peeking out from behind curtains, stepping onto porches, watching like it was a show. Brenda stood taller, folding her arms as if she had personally summoned justice. The officers approached the shoreline just as Elijah was rowing back in. He guided the boat smoothly to the dock, tied it off, and stepped onto the wooden boards. With calm, deliberate movements, he was taller than both officers, his frame broad and steady, his cowboy hat shading his eyes. "Sir," one officer began, his tone professional, "we've received complaints that you're trespassing on HOA property." Elijah said nothing at first. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Without rushing, he handed it to the officer. "Take a look," he said evenly. The officer unfolded the papers, property deeds, maps, all signed and sealed. Elijah had come prepared. He knew Brenda's kind of fight before it even began. "This lake," Elijah continued, his voice deep and steady, "sits on my property line. I own it. The HOA has rights to access, but ownership never changed hands. I'm within my rights to be here." The officers read the documents, exchanged glances, and then one of them nodded slightly. "He's right," he said to his partner. "This checks out." The second officer looked at Brenda, who had stomped closer, her face flushed with indignation. But, that can't be right," she sputtered. "We've always used this lake as community property. We pay fees to maintain it." "We, ma'am," the officer interrupted, his patience thinning. "The ownership records are clear. This man is not trespassing." Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. Her supporters muttered angrily, some scowling at Elijah, as if the lake had just been stolen from them. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't argue. He simply tipped his hat toward the officers, then toward the crowd. "Y'all have a nice evening," he said. His voice polite but firm. He loaded his boat onto a trailer hitched to his truck, each movement unhurried, deliberate. Then he climbed into the cab, started the engine. The guy dove back to his ranch. Behind him, the HOA crowd erupted into chatter. Brenda's voice rose above them all, promising lawsuits, emergency meetings, action. But Elijah didn't hear any of it. His windows were rolled down, and as he drove up the dirt path to his land, the sound of cicadas filled the evening. He looked out at the lake glinting behind him, and a quiet smile touched his lips. Still, as he parked beside his barn and stepped out into the cool twilight, Elijah felt something stirring inside him. He had defended his right to the lake that day, but it wasn't over. Brenda and her crew hadn't just tried to take away his peace, they had tried to strip him of his dignity. And he knew in his bones that they would try again. Sitting on his porch that night, Elijah leaned back in, his chair hat tipped over his eyes, and listened to the frogs croaking by the water. He thought about the smug faces of the neighbors, about Brenda's shrill voice, declaring rules she had no right to make. His hands flexed against the armrests, strong and steady, the hands of a man who had built his life from the dirt up. "They want to fight?" he thought. "Then maybe it's time I stop waiting for them to bring it and start deciding how I'm going to end it." For Elijah, it was never about the boat. It was about respect. And that night, as the stars flickered awake above the quiet ranch, he made a silent promise to himself. The next move would be his. The morning after the police had left and the lake returned to its stillness, Elijah woke. Before the sun crested over the hills, he brewed his coffee, black and strong, and stood by the window of his ranch house, gazing out at the wide stretch of water glimmering faintly in the early light. The cedar boat sat snug on its trailer outside, a quiet reminder of yesterday's confrontation. Most men would have left it at that, prove the point, pack up, and let the trouble simmer down. But Elijah wasn't most men. He'd grown up watching his grandfather battle through life's unfairness with dignity. He'd seen the way property lines, laws, and documents had been used against men like him, stripping them of what they had earned. Their voices drowned out by neighbors with louder mouths and deeper pockets. Elijah had sworn that no one, not Brenda, not her HOA, not anyone would ever tell him he didn't belong on his own land. He sipped his coffee slowly, considering his next move. Down by the lake, the HOA was already buzzing. Brenda had wasted no time after her humiliation. The night before, by 9 a.m., she had gathered a cluster of her closest allies in the Marina pavilion, a wide deck where neighbors liked to hold parties and launch their jet skis. They huddled around her, sipping mimosas and speaking in clipped, furious tones. "He embarrassed us in front of the entire neighborhood," one of the men muttered. "The cops practically sided with him." "He doesn't care about the rules," another chimed in. "Osho, if we don't do something, he'll be out there every day like it's his own private lake." Brenda slammed her mimosa glass onto the table, her eyes flashing. "It is our lake," she snapped. "We pay HOA dues to maintain the marina, the docks, the pavilion, all of it. He can wave those deeds around all he wants, but as long as I'm president, We'll make sure he can't just stroll in and act like he owns the place." One of the women leaned in. "But he does own it. That's what the officer said." Brenda's lips tightened into a thin, defiant line. "Then we'll fight ownership in court. We'll hit him with noise complaints, property violations, environmental reports. If he so much as drops an anchor in the wrong spot, I'll have code enforcement at his door. I didn't spend 20 years building this neighborhood's prestige just to have it ruined by some cowboy playing captain." The group nodded grimly, but even among them, there was unease. Elijah had shown he wasn't intimidated. They all remembered the calm, steady way he had handled the officers, the quiet authority in his voice. He hadn't raised it once, yet everyone felt the weight of it. By late afternoon, rumors were already flying through the community app. Brenda had posted a long, stern message about unsanctioned use of HOA facilities, warning residents about potential hazards to safety. She didn't name Elijah, but everyone knew. Screenshots of deeds, maps, and old property records were passed around like contraband, neighbors taking sides. Some believed Brenda's fiery declarations. Others whispered that maybe Elijah really did own the lake. Maybe the HOA had overstepped. Back at his ranch, Elijah wasn't scrolling through the gossip threads. He was in town, sitting in the quiet office of a man named Carson, a lawyer he trusted. The office smelled faintly of old books and cedar, and Carson leaned back in his chair as he examined the thick folder Elijah had brought. "You were smart to keep everything," Carson said finally, tapping the deed. "These records are airtight. That lake's yours, no question. The HOA can make noise, but they don't have a leg to stand on legally." "I figured as much," Elijah said, his deep voice calm. "But Brenda isn't the kind to stop. She'll keep pushing. She wants me boxed in." Carson raised an eyebrow. "So what are you thinking?" Elijah leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "I'm not interested in just defending myself anymore. I want to make sure they can't come at me again. I've been looking into something. The marina, the pavilion, the docks, they're all built on a parcel the HOA leases from the county. Lease is almost up. County's looking to sell." Carson's brows lifted in surprise, then slowly arched into a smile. "And you're thinking of buying it?" Elijah's eyes narrowed, steady and resolute. "They want to play games on my water? Then they'll be paying me to do it." By the time Elijah left the lawyer's office, the sun was dipping low again, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold. He drove his truck back to the ranch, dust swirling behind him on the dirt road, and parked at his usual spot by the barn. He felt the weight of his decision sitting solid in his chest. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was planning a move that would shift the whole balance of power. That night, Brenda called an emergency HOA meeting. The community center was packed, the air heavy with tension. She stood at the front, papers clutched in her hand, her voice sharp as she riled. Up the crowd. "Elijah Brooks thinks he's above the rules," she declared. "He thinks he can waltz onto our marina, use our facilities, and thumb his nose at the people who built this community. We cannot let him undermine us." Some nodded and muttered their agreement, but others sat back, arms crossed, unsure. Man from the back raised his hand. "But didn't the police say he owned the lake? If that's true, maybe we should." Brenda cut him off sharply. "Ownership is complicated. Nothing's final until lawyers decide. In the meantime, we enforce our policies." She slammed her papers onto the podium. "I want everyone here to document any infraction. Loud machinery, odd smells, fences out of code, cattle too close to property lines, anything. If we build a record, we can push him out legally." The crowd broke into murmurs, but Elijah's name kept surfacing in their whispers like a storm gathering force. What Brenda didn't know was that Elijah already had the county on his side. The very next day, he sat in a boardroom across from two county officials reviewing terms for the Marina parcel. The HOA had assumed they'd automatically renew their lease, but Elijah had quietly moved faster. He had resources, money saved from his ranching contracts, and more importantly, a determination fueled by Brenda's arrogance. "Mr. Brooks," one of the officials said, sliding a folder across the table, "if you're prepared to purchase, We'd much rather sell than continue leasing. The HOA hasn't exactly been easy to work with. You, on the other hand, maintain your land, pay your taxes on time. Frankly, we think the lake would be in better hands." Elijah didn't smile. He simply nodded, steady as always, signed the preliminary paperwork. By the end of the week, whispers were spreading again, but this time, not from Brenda. A few neighbors had caught wind that something big was happening. They saw Elijah. Meeting county officials, saw documents exchanged, handshakes made. Rumors trickled through the community app like water through cracks. Brenda tried to stamp them out, insisting it was all lies. But even she couldn't ignore the growing unease. Every time she looked out at the marina, she couldn't shake the image of Elijah's calm, unbothered face as he had tipped his hat that first night. It haunted her, like he had known something she didn't. Elijah, meanwhile, prepared quietly. He didn't confront Brenda. He didn't post on the app. He went about his days working the ranch, repairing fences, feeding his cattle, rowing his cedar boat when the sun dipped low. But under the surface, every move was deliberate. Every decision part of a plan, because Elijah Brooks wasn't just waiting for Brenda to make her next move. He was setting the board for the checkmate, and the day was coming soon when Brenda and her HOA army would realize the lake they thought they owned was no longer theirs to control, not the water, not the docks, not even the pavilion where they stood gossiping over mimosas. Elijah wasn't just going to defend his peace. He was about to own their pride. The morning the announcement came, the lake was wrapped in mist, the kind that clings low to the surface and blurs the edges of everything it touches. Brenda stepped out onto the pavilion deck with a steaming cup of coffee, trying to calm her nerves. She hadn't slept much the night before. The whispers about Elijah buying the marina were spreading too quickly, and the county office hadn't returned her calls. She hated not being in control. Her phone buzzed with a message in the HOA group chat. Urgent. County board meeting today at noon. Marina ownership transfer on the agenda. Brenda's heart dropped. She slammed her cup onto the railing, spilling coffee onto her perfectly pressed blouse, but she didn't even flinch. Instead, she grabbed her keys and stormed to her car, determination tightening every line of her face. Meanwhile, Elijah was already downtown, dressed in a crisp button-down and boots polished to a shine. He walked into the county courthouse with the calm stride of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. Carson, his lawyer, walked beside him, carrying a briefcase that held the final contracts. The meeting room filled quickly. Brenda and her loyal supporters sat in the front row, whispering and shooting daggers with their eyes every time Elijah so much as shifted in his chair. The neighbors filled the back rows, eager to see how this clash would end. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The county chairwoman, a stern woman with gray hair tied neatly into a bun, called the session to order. She shuffled a stack of papers and cleared her throat. On today's agenda, the pending transfer of ownership for Parcel 11B, encompassing the Marina Pavilion and adjoining dock facilities. Brenda shot to her feet before the woman could continue. "Excuse me, Madam Chair, but this is absurd. The HOA has leased that parcel for decades. It's ours. This man," she pointed a trembling finger toward Elijah, "has no right to swoop in and take it from under us." The chairwoman peered over her glasses, unimpressed. "Mrs. Green, you will sit down until it's your turn to speak." Brenda's face flushed crimson, but she lowered herself back into her seat with a huff, glaring at Elijah. He didn't so much as look her way. His eyes stayed on the chairwoman, steady and calm. The proceedings continued. Carson presented the paperwork detailing Elijah's bid, the funding, and his intention to purchase the property outright. I highlighted Elijah's spotless record as a landowner, his consistent tax history, and his family's long-standing connection to the region. Brenda's turn came next. She practically leaped to the podium, waving a thick binder filled with supposed violations, community testimonies, glossy photographs of neighborhood barbecues at the marina. "This place belongs to us," she cried. "We built it, we maintain it, and we rely on it. Without it, our community loses its heart." The chairwoman let her finish, then leaned forward. "Mrs. Green, the county has reviewed the HOA's lease. It is expiring, and the HOA has made no offer to purchase. Mr. Brooks did. The law is clear. Brenda sputtered, but the gavel came down. Motion carried. Transfer approved. Gasps rippled through the room. Some neighbors sat in stunned silence. Others muttered in disbelief. Elijah rose slowly, shook Carson's hand, and turned to face the crowd. His expression was calm, but his presence filled the room with quiet authority. Brenda, however, erupted. "This isn't over," she shrieked. "You can't just waltz in here and take what's ours." "I'll fight you every step of the way, Elijah Brooks. Every step." For the first time that day, Elijah finally looked at her. His gaze was steady, his voice low, but cutting through the noise like a blade. "You've been fighting me since the day I put my boat in my own lake, Brenda. But you don't understand, I'm not fighting you. I'm just taking back what was mine all along." The room went silent. Brenda's face twisted with rage, but she had no words. By evening, the news spread like wildfire. Elijah Brooks now owned the marina, the docks, and the pavilion. The HOA, once so sure of its dominance, was left scrambling. Brenda stormed from house to house, rallying her supporters. But more and more neighbors began questioning whether she had led them into disaster. Some even approached Elijah directly, offering cautious congratulations, while others kept their distance. Unsure of where they stood in the new order, Elijah returned to his ranch that night, his cedar boat glinting in the moonlight as he parked it by the lake once more. But this time, when he floated it into the water, there was no one to stop him. The marina lights glowed in the distance, not as a forbidden space, but as property he now owned. The days that followed were surreal. Brenda tried everything, filing injunctions, blasting furious posts on the community app, even staging protests at the marina gates. But one by one, her efforts fell apart. The county had spoken, the paperwork was signed, and legally she had no foothold left. Then came the letter. Elijah had it drafted by Carson, typed in clear formal language, and sent to every household in the community. It stated simply, "All residents are welcome to continue using the marina facilities as before. There will be no fees, no restrictions, no HOA oversight. The lake belongs to everyone who respects it. That is my only rule." The neighbors were stunned. After weeks of fear and tension, Elijah wasn't closing the marina despite them. He was opening it wider than it had ever been under the HOA. For many, it was a relief. For others, it was a humiliation, proof that Elijah had more grace and victory than Brenda had ever shown in power. Brenda, however, couldn't bear it. Her control was shattered, her authority crumbling day by day as the community began drifting toward Elijah's quiet leadership instead of her endless tirades. She stopped showing up at meetings, her once loyal allies slipping away. Eventually, word spread that she'd resigned as HOA president altogether. One warm evening weeks later, Elijah stood on the dock watching children laugh and splash in the water while parents grilled hot dogs on the pavilion deck. The air was alive with the sound of music, conversation, and joy. His boat bobbed gently against the dock, catching the last golden rays of the sunset. A neighbor approached. A man Elijah didn't know well but who had always kept his distance before. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Brooks, wanted to say thank you for not shutting it all down, for, well, being better than the rest of us." Elijah gave a small, knowing smile. "It's just water and wood, but it brings people together. That's worth protecting." As the man walked away, Elijah turned his eyes back to the lake. The mist was gone now, the water reflecting the clear night sky. He thought of his grandfather, of all the years of struggle, and of the promise he had made to himself never to be pushed off. What was rightfully his, he had kept that promise. Brenda's voice was gone, replaced by laughter echoing across the lake. The HOA's grip had dissolved, replaced by something simpler, freer. And Elijah knew that from this day forward, no one could ever tell him where he belonged again. He didn't just own the ranch. He didn't just own the boat. He didn't even just own the lake. He owned the peace he had fought for in this time. Nobody could take it away. The story ended where it had begun. One man, his boat, and the water that mirrored his strength. And as Elijah tipped his hat to the setting sun, the lake seemed to whisper back. Finally, it was his story end.